welcome back. And as we return to Drive Home Reviews meets Abbott and Costello, we return also to MGM with what would prove to be their last film at MGM for a little bit. MGM had decided not to renew their contract for whatever reason. Now, for me personally, as I mentioned, Lost in a Harem was not a favorable outing for them. I just feel it did not hang together very well. But I'm happy to say that with Abbott and Costello in Hollywood, they returned to form. The scenario for this one is fairly self-explanatory. Where are we going to let the boys run loose? Well, let them run loose in Hollywood. And I think this was a smart idea, not just from a business standpoint, because budget-wise, you could just film it all on your own back lot, which they did. But I think, as I've mentioned multiple times during the course of this series, Abbott and Costello were the kings of Hollywood for a very long time. They were the top grossing films for like 2 or 3 years, and even after their supposed heyday dropped off, they were still reliable box office. These guys were, again, kind of the kings of Hollywood, and yet it doesn't ever feel to me, many years later, that Hollywood ever really respected them. I don't know how it was back then, but as I said, they're never really featured on things like Turner Classic Movies, and even though they themselves were like huge box office stars, it didn't seem like the other stars ever really came to them, at least in the case of their movies. They were always the stars of the film, and the rest of the cast was filled out with, contract players, day players, that type of thing. Character actors, all of whom have had or most of whom I should say have had very long and prosperous careers because they were character actors. But a lot of big stars never really came to play. Dick Powell for In the Navy was one of the few, and then later on we'll get people like Boris Karloff. But even Boris Karloff, he was a big star, but in a very niche market. Now, their radio show, that attracted all sorts of A-list talent. Cary Grant, Lucille Ball, Humphrey Bogart, Frank Sinatra. I mean, they had a lot of big names on their radio show, and but a lot of those names didn't really translate over to their films, which it always kind of makes me feel like they were the comedies were always kind of looked down on, almost. The actual comedians, you get people like Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn making terrible screwball comedies like Bringing Up Babies, but they were serious actors, and then they'd go do their serious pictures. So the people who were just kind of solid comedians, it always felt like they were kind of shuffled to the side. So one of the big selling points of this one is letting Bud and Lou kind of run ragged and hobnob with some of the bigger stars of the time. I say bigger stars, there aren't a lot of big cameos in this. The bigger stars, the bigger MGM contract players aren't in this one, but they do rub shoulders with other Hollywood talent, and it's nice to see that. It's nice to see that they are, they are included in the Hollywood community. I know they were, but in terms of, the images we have, the media we have, it's nice to see them actually being able to hobnob with their fellow celebrities at the time. So, what is this one about? Well, as I've mentioned, the scenario, Bud and Lou run wild in Hollywood, pretty plain and simple. But what's the plot? Well, in this one, Bud and Lou play Hollywood barbers, working at one of the premier barber shops, and recently one of their co-workers, she was discovered. That old Hollywood story of, you're walking down the street and that guy with the big cigar goes, that guy over there, perfect for my picture. And that's kind of what they're playing on here. Is this girl was cutting hair, and the producer said, you must star in my next big budget musical. So their friend Claire has just signed this contract, and her co-star is he's kind of a jackass. He's let's put it this way, if the Me Too movement was around back then, he would have been one of those called out. He's basically the Harvey Weinstein of of the 1940s movie scene. The character, not the actor. Let me stress that, at least as far as I know. But anyway, her co-star is an asshole, and she doesn't like him. He's hitting on her. Ew. Long story short, Bud and Lou run into this kid from Palookaville who comes to Hollywood and wants to be a star, and he's been kicked around, and they decide they're going to be his agent because they see that agents make all of this money. And they basically talk him into this picture with their friend Claire. And the whole film is them getting him into the picture, then he gets kicked off the picture, and then getting him back in the picture. So it's them just kind of wheeling and dealing and playing the Hollywood game in their traditional Abbott and Costello fashion. So that's the basic rundown of it. So I'm going to say, just right up, I really enjoy this one. I enjoy about 2/3 of this one. There's a chunk in the middle I'm not as fond of, but the early part of this movie, like Acts 1 and 2, are just really, really good and really, really funny. Once again, I think as their career goes on, and we're going to see this in the next couple pictures that we look at, the boys are trying to move away from the routine-driven story, you know, like they had in their formula for their early pictures, you know, just a basic scenario and then move us from, you know, bit to bit to bit. And they're trying to move away from that to more plot-specific elements. And that's why I really like, again, the first 2/3 of this film, because there are none of the kind of traditional Abbott and Costello routines in this. It's just them responding to the situation. For instance, like the very first scene of the film is Lou giving a haircut to a popular actor of the time named Rags Ragland. You know, Rags Ragland being a former vaudeville star. And just him giving him a haircut, it's just a really funny bit. Rags Ragland was, as I said, was a vaudeville star in his own right. So he understood that kind of vaudeville timing, and he works really well off of Lou and Bud in that scene. So just letting them kind of enjoy the situation and have fun causing chaos on a big budget Hollywood movie is a lot of fun. Where the film falls down, I think where it hits a stumbling block, is right as we're going out of Act 2 and into Act 3. They do have one of their classic routines in there. And unfortunately, it's not one of their good ones. It's one where Lou can't sleep, and Bud brings him a record from some doctor who's a sleep doctor, and the doctor is, telling, go to sleep, rest your head. But Lou falls asleep, but then the record starts to skip, and Bud has to come in. It's this whole thing. It's kind of like the All Right number from Hit the Ice, where Bud's hiding behind the piano with the Victrola and falls asleep. It's the same basic bit here. And I don't know, for some reason, Abbott and Costello routines that involve Bud trying to turn off a Victrola and then falling asleep in the middle of trying to turn off a Victrola, it just doesn't do it for me. And in this case, it really stops the plot dead. It really does, and the bit goes on for a while. I don't think MGM quite got the hang of having the routines go a specific amount of time and then cutting them off. I don't think they had quite gotten, like Gene Yarbrough did with a lot of their movies, of knowing, okay, this is how long the bit can go, and then we got to move on to the next thing. So this one goes on for a while, and again, it feels very tacked on, and it just kind of stops the plot dead, and then it's very hard to kind of jump back in and get back on the upswing with the rest of the story. That's kind of the major weakness. Just that one bit is one of the major weaknesses of the film. The other thing, and it's not a weakness necessarily, it's just kind of the way it is. Once again, our co-stars, our boy-girl story, Robert Stanton playing the boy's young client, Frances Rafferty playing Claire, their friend. They're fine. They're just dull. There's just nothing about them. I'm happy that in this case, the young man, the goody young man is a catalyst for the story. So at least they don't feel as tacked on. They are in the same plot as Bud and Lou, but you know, there's nothing to his character. There's nothing really to Claire's character. She's a good dancer. She's a hell of a good dancer and singer. You know, I'll also say that I feel like the musical numbers in this one aren't as tacked on. The first two are not good, really. The last one is a lot of fun. Big MGM musical number. You know what's funny about this? You know, a lot of movies that are about making movies, what I find happens in a lot of those is that the movie within a movie that they're making suddenly kind of makes you wonder. It's like, I kind of want to see that movie. Like, so the climax of this film is they're shooting a big production number for this fake movie that they've been trying to get this kid into, and it's the name of it is like Love for Two or Romance for Two, so it sounds like this little love story. But apparently this love story has a huge fucking set piece of blowing up an entire carnival set. You know, the plot, he says, oh, this is the scene where the gangsters blow up the set. It's like, I want to see this fucking movie. What the hell's going on in this film? Where gamblers are blowing up the Midway. What the hell is that about? During the middle of a musical number. Can you imagine seeing that? A big musical number, big loud, you're like, hey, then boom, everything blows up. You're like, shit. So yeah, they're fine. They're fine. The other thing, rounding out the cast is another great character actor named Jean Porter, as Lou's kind of love interest in this one. She's kind of in that Peggy Ryan category. She's smaller. She's got kind of a rounder face. She's got a little baby face, kind of like he does. So she's got kind of the cuter thing going for her. And she's good. She works well off of him. It's just they don't do much with her. She's not really in the movie that much. So they had this really a good actor and someone who was working well off Lou, but they don't really do much with her. So that's not really a criticism, because again, the focus is on them, as it should be. But you know, I kind of wish they had done more with Jean Porter. So it sounds like I'm coming down on this film, and I'm not really. I'm just saying these are kind of the weaker parts. Generally, this film is very strong. The high point of this movie for me is a bit that happens kind of fairly early on, but it's a big chunk of the middle of the picture. And this is where Bud and Lou sneak on to the film lot, the studio, and are being chased by studio police, and they're just running all over, causing all this chaos. And mainly Lou is just running, and he's having all these interactions with all of these celebrities, and he's on these different pictures. As he's running, he hides out in the studio school and is interacting with a bunch of the child stars of the time. You know, Dean Stockwell is in there. Jackie Jenkins and Sharon McManus, who were, again, big child stars at the time. People probably don't know their names now, but they were pretty big names at the time. You know, or in there. That's a really cute scene. As I've mentioned before, Lou very much kind of reminds me of John Candy in that anytime he's working with kids, it's just a really kind of touching moment. And in this one, where he's telling this story and doing these jokes with these kids, and they're gathered around him, and you can see like these little kids just laughing at him, and you can tell that he is just loving that. You know, that he is just loving kind of being in the midst of these kids. You know, it's a funny moment, but just the look on his face and the look on their faces when they're working with him, it's very sweet. He runs into Lucille Ball, who is probably the biggest name star in the film, other than them. Definitely the most famous in retrospect. Again, I know a lot of these stars were probably big in their day, but their names have kind of faded a little bit. But Lucille Ball, everybody knows her. Apparently, from what I've read, she and Lou were actually very good friends in real life. In fact, later on, when in real life Lucille Ball would be accused of being a communist, which again back then was like there are a few things worse than back in the day in Hollywood than being accused of being a communist. Sorry, the camera got tilted. Lou was one of the only people that really came to bat for her. So she's in there for a bit. What's funny is that she's working on some like costume period drama, which I don't think Lucille Ball was ever in any kind of drama, let alone a big costumey drama. But it's a funny scene, and then he ends up on a Western where they mistake him for a stunt dummy. So, of course, he's getting banged up and beat around and punched out by, you know, all these actors. It's, like I say, it's the highlight of the movie, is him running around and just kind of wreaking havoc on this movie set. It has the traditional chase scene at the end, which isn't too bad. It's intercut. This is one you'd think I'd hate, because it's mixing the two things I don't like in Abbott and Costello movies, the end chase scene and the big musical numbers, and here it's splicing them together. But it works. It works fairly well, I think. It's one of the better ones. It's one I can watch. I don't think they get too out of it, but you know, it's still a bit much. I've never been a fan of the big chase scenes. All in all, I really enjoy this one. So far, obviously, I think Rio Rita is the standout of their MGM films. But I do think their best one for MGM is coming up later on when they go back there to do another picture. But for what it is, this was a fun one. Like I say, it's fun to see them interacting with other celebrities. It's fun just to see what they can get into on a movie studio lot, and just yeah, it gives it a phonetic energy that really sets it apart. So I appreciate this one. I like Abbott and Costello in Hollywood. The little drag in the middle doesn't bug me too much. But yeah, another good entry. So what's going to happen next when we return is a big change is going to take place. As we've been going through, one of the first things I pointed out in one of the first reviews I did, for Buck Privates, I talked about the Abbott and Costello formula, the way their movies were made, and this kind of pattern the stories followed. And I mentioned back when they came back from the lost year, came back with In Society, that this middle portion of their career, the script was going to get flipped, and the formula for their films was going to change. And that is very true. It's been subtly changing over these last couple films that we've been talking about, but it's going to come home to roost with their next picture. The formula is going to be very different. It's going to be a very different feel and a very different type of movie for Abbott and Costello, which is going to be kind of the way their movies are going to be done for a little while. So I look forward to taking a look at this as the Abbott and Costello formula gets flipped, and we take a look at what happens when Lou decides to become a vacuum cleaner salesman in Little Giant. So thank you very much for joining me, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.